Shells are falling short of the surf line, not by accident. The water is red where the waves break. Smoke drifts low across the sand, stinging the eyes, mixing with the metallic smell of blood and cordite. A landing craft burns crooked in the tide, its ramp still down, its dead still inside. A young infantryman lies half buried in wet sand, his helmet gone, his hands shaking violently. Then they stop shaking. A medic drops beside him, no time for morphine, no time for words. He presses a hand into the wound and feels warmth pouring between his fingers. The soldier's lips move, no sound comes out. Around them, bullets snap past like tearing cloth. The medic reaches into his bag and pulls out something that does not look like salvation. A small glass bottle. Inside it, powder, not blood, powder. He rips it open, splashes saline into the vial, and begins to shake. If this works, the boy might live long enough to reach a surgeon. If it doesn't, the medic drives the needle into his vein anyway. In this war, most men do not die from bullets. They die from what happens after. A torn artery, a stomach ripped open, a leg shattered by shrapnel. The bleeding does the rest. A man can survive a wound that looks catastrophic. He can even keep fighting for a few minutes. But once enough blood leaves the body, something invisible begins to happen. The heart beats faster, the skin turns pale, the mind drifts. Blood pressure collapses, organs begin to fail. They call it shock. On paper, the solution seems simple. Give him blood. But war does not happen on paper. Whole blood is fragile. It must be typed, stored carefully, kept cool, protected from contamination. Even in well-equipped hospitals, transfusions are delicate procedures. Now imagine doing that on an open beach, under artillery fire, with sand blowing into open wounds and stretchers floating in seawater. There are no refrigerators in foxholes, no sterile wards behind hedgerows, no orderly rows of labeled bottles waiting on polished trays. There are only medics with canvas bags and whatever they can carry on their backs. And when an invasion force lands on hostile shores, thousands of wounded men arrive within hours. The need is immediate, relentless, overwhelming. Blood spoils. Time does not wait. So the army needed something lighter, something that would not rot in the heat, something that could survive a parachute drop or a saltwater landing, something that could be carried forward instead of shipped back. Out there on the sand, with a dying soldier fading in his arms, a medic is not thinking about logistics. But the war is. And somewhere, years before this invasion began, someone had already understood that if blood could not reach the battlefield, then the battlefield would have to change blood. The aid station is not a building. It is a crater in the sand. 2 torn tarps strung between steel obstacles. A folding table dragged off a landing. Craft. Stretchers laid in a crooked row, boots hanging over the edges, dog tags clinking softly whenever artillery lands too close. This is where the wounded come first, not to be healed, to be sorted. A lieutenant with half his thigh gone, a radio operator clutching his abdomen, a machine gunner who can't stop apologizing because he can't feel his legs. The medic moves between them with mechanical focus. Check airway, check breathing, find the bleeding, stop what you can, mark what you can't. There is no silence here, only overlapping sound. Groans, orders shouted over shell bursts, the flat crack of rifle fire from the dunes, someone yelling for plasma before the word has even fully formed in his mouth. The glass vial is already mixed now, clear fluid where powder had been seconds earlier. He hangs it from a broken rifle stuck upright in the sand. Gravity becomes his assistant. The line snakes down to the soldier's arm. The needle sits steady despite the shaking. Ground. There is no time to wonder if this is safe. No time to debate long-term effects. The soldier's pulse had been thready, almost gone. Now it flutters back against the medic's fingertips. Weak, but there. Around them, the tide creeps closer. Another landing craft grinds onto the beach. More wounded spill forward. This is not surgery. This is bargaining. Bargaining for minutes, because somewhere behind this chaos, beyond the dunes, beyond the smoke, there are surgeons waiting. And if a man can reach them alive, he has a chance. But that chance depends on what is flowing through this line. And that story did not begin on this beach. It began in a laboratory, far from gunfire, where the problem of blood was being taken apart piece by piece. Years before the beach turned red, The war had already begun its quiet work in laboratories, not with rifles, with centrifuges. In sterile rooms far from artillery fire, doctors were asking a brutal question. What exactly does a dying man need most? Is it blood itself, or something inside it? When a patient goes into shock, it is not just the red cells that matter. It is volume, it is pressure. It is the thin straw-colored liquid that carries proteins, clotting factors, and the chemistry that keeps organs alive. Plasma. If the red cells are the carriers of oxygen, plasma is the river they float in, and rivers, unlike cells, can travel more easily. Researchers began separating plasma from whole blood, spinning it down, removing what required strict typing, studying what remained. They discovered something remarkable. Plasma could be stored longer than whole blood. It could be pooled. It could be transported in ways whole blood could not. And then came the breakthrough that war demanded. Remove the water, freeze it, dry it, reduce it to something stable, something light, something that would not spoil in a crate crossing the Atlantic or in a supply truck bouncing toward the front. What remained was not dramatic. No glowing liquid, no miracle cure, just powder. Powder that could sit on a shelf for months, powder that could survive heat and distance, powder that, when mixed with sterile water, became plasma again, the kind of thing a medic could carry in a pocket instead of a cooler. But scaling that idea from laboratory experiment to battlefield reality required more than chemistry. It required organization, collection, trust, and one physician, in particular, would help transform plasma from theory into lifeline, building a system that could feed an army's need for blood without ever setting foot on the front lines. Because long before the invasion fleets assembled in England, another kind of mobilization had already begun. One measured not in divisions, but in pints. Whole blood is powerful. It carries oxygen. It carries life. It is what surgeons reach for in bright operating rooms with polished steel instruments and controlled temperatures. But war does not offer controlled temperatures. War offers mud, heat, salt water, dust blown into open wounds. In the early years of the conflict, military planners faced an unforgiving truth. The modern battlefield was moving faster than medicine could follow. Mechanized warfare meant casualties appeared in sudden waves, hundreds in a single hour. Airborne drops scattered men across fields and forests. Amphibious invasions dumped thousands onto exposed beaches with no infrastructure behind them. Blood banks could exist in cities. They could exist in rear hospitals. They could not exist in foxholes. Whole blood required matching types. A mistake could kill a man as surely as enemy fire. It required refrigeration, careful handling, constant monitoring. Even when stored properly, it had a limited lifespan, and every mile between donor and wounded soldier increased the chance it would spoil. Plasma changed the equation. When red blood cells are removed, what remains is the fluid that maintains circulation and stabilizes blood pressure. Plasma does not carry oxygen the way red cells do, but in the first minutes after catastrophic injury, oxygen delivery is not the only battle. Volume is. When a man bleeds out, his heart has nothing left to pump. Blood pressure collapses. Organs begin shutting down, not instantly, but steadily. The brain clouds. The kidneys fail. The body cools. Plasma restores volume. It fills the vascular system enough to keep circulation moving. It buys time. And in war, time is the rarest commodity of all. Unlike whole blood, plasma could be pooled from multiple donors. It did not require the same strict type matching because it lacked the red cells that triggered most transfusion reactions. That made it vastly more flexible in emergency conditions. More importantly, once dried, it could sit in crates stacked by the thousands, waiting to be called forward. No refrigeration units rumbling behind the lines, no frantic search for the right blood type while a pulse faded. Just a sealed container, powder, water, and a chance. By the time Allied forces began planning massive operations across 2 continents, plasma had become something revolutionary, not merely a medical supply, but a logistical weapon. It could move where blood could not, and when the shooting started, it would be there long before a surgeon ever arrived. An idea in a laboratory does not win wars. Systems do. By 1940, Britain was bleeding. German bombs were falling on London. Civilian hospitals overflowed. Surgeons needed blood faster than it could be collected, processed, and shipped. The crisis forced a new kind of urgency, one that demanded organization on an industrial scale. That is where Charles Drew entered the story. Drew was a surgeon, a researcher, and something equally rare, an architect of systems. He understood that separating plasma from whole blood was only the first step. The real challenge was scale. How do you collect thousands of donations? How do you standardize processing? How do you ensure sterility across cities? How do you move a fragile medical product across an ocean at war? Under his leadership, plasma collection became streamlined and disciplined. Donation centers were coordinated, blood was processed efficiently, plasma was separated, bottled, preserved, cataloged. What had been experimental became organized. What had been fragile became transportable. Shipments of plasma crossed the Atlantic to support Britain during its darkest hours. It was one of the first times in history that blood products were mobilized like munitions, tracked, counted, delivered with strategic precision. But even as the system expanded, contradictions surfaced. America was fighting a regime built on racial ideology. Yet at home, policies mandated the segregation of blood donations. The science did not support it. Plasma, once separated, was biologically indistinguishable by race, yet labels were required. Charles Drew objected. He knew the chemistry did not change based on the donor's skin color, but war is not immune to politics, and even life-saving systems can become entangled in prejudice. Still, the machinery he helped build continued forward. Collection centers multiplied, processing became faster, storage improved. By the time American forces prepared for large-scale offensives in North Africa, Italy, and eventually France, plasma was no longer theoretical. It was stockpiled, crated, numbered, ready. Drew would not stand on the beaches of Normandy. He would not crouch in a crater with artillery falling around him. But without the systems he helped construct, the medic kneeling in that sand would have had nothing to hang from a rifle barrel. Because innovation is only the beginning. Scale is what saves lives. An army does not move on courage alone. It moves on supply lines. By 1943, the theory had become production. Plasma was no longer confined to theater, hospital corridors, or research journals. It was being manufactured, dried, sealed, and packed in standardized kits designed for war. Each kit was simple: a glass bottle containing pale, dehydrated plasma, a second container of sterile water, rubber tubing, a needle, instructions that could be followed even in failing light, everything a medic needed, compressed into something that fit inside a canvas bag. The freeze-drying process changed the battlefield more than most soldiers ever realized. By removing moisture under controlled conditions, plasma could be stabilized for long periods without refrigeration. It could survive transport across oceans, endure heat in supply depots, and bounce in the back of trucks heading toward the front. It could even survive an airborne drop. Crates of dried plasma moved with invasion fleets. They were stacked inside transport ships bound for North Africa, Italy, and eventually the English coast in preparation for something much larger. Planners knew what mass amphibious assault would mean. Thousands of casualties within hours, beaches with no infrastructure, surgeons still offshore while men bled in the surf. Refrigerated whole blood could not land in the first wave, but dried plasma could. So it went ashore with the medics, packed beside bandages and morphine syrettes, carried through smoke and confusion, issued not as experimental novelty but as standard equipment. To the soldiers fighting forward, it looked unimpressive, no different from any other medical supply. But to the men trained to use it, it represented a shift in power. For the first time in history, a soldier who might once have died before reaching a hospital could be stabilized where he fell. Not healed, stabilized. Given minutes, and sometimes minutes were enough to change everything. Because once dried plasma reached the battlefield, the distance between wound and operating table began to shrink, not geographically, biologically. The theory was clean. The packaging was precise. The instructions were printed in calm, orderly type. But none of that mattered once the shooting started. Back on the beach, the medic does not have a laboratory. He has sand in the wound. He has seawater soaking through bandages. He has a boy whose pulse is slipping through his fingers. The plasma runs down the tube in a thin, steady line, clear, almost innocent-looking. There is no dramatic transformation, no sudden gasp, no miracle, just a waiting game measured in heartbeats. Another shell lands close enough to lift sand into the air like a curtain. The medic shields the bottle with his body, instinctively protecting the fragile glass from shattering. Around him, other men are screaming for stretchers. A corpsman nearby is shouting that he's out of tourniquets. Someone else is asking who can still walk. There is no controlled environment here, only judgment. Because using plasma is not without risk. Too much fluid can overwhelm a damaged system. Too little does nothing. The medic must guess, guided by training, by experience, by the feel of a pulse under trembling fingertips. He watches the soldier's face. The gray tint eases slightly. The eyelids flutter. A faint swallow. It is not victory. It is possibility. And that possibility is fragile. Plasma cannot replace lost red cells. It cannot repair torn organs. It cannot close a wound. All it can do is hold the line, hold blood pressure high enough, hold organs alive long enough, hold a man in that narrow space between fading and fighting. A stretcher team appears through the smoke. The landing craft that brought them in has been cleared to take wounded back toward the ships offshore. The medic clamps the line, pulls the needle free, and presses gauze over the puncture. The soldier is still alive. Barely. They lift him and begin moving toward the surf. Behind them, more wounded arrive. More vials are opened. More powder becomes plasma. And on a beach that was never meant to be a hospital, men gamble with glass bottles and gravity, trying to steal minutes from death before death can claim its due. The stretcher tilts as they move, not carefully, quickly. Boots splash through shallow surf. A machine gun rattles from the dunes. The wounded man's head rolls with each step, mouth open, eyes half-focused on nothing at all. He is not saved. He is suspended. The plasma has done what it was meant to do. His pulse, once nearly gone, now beats in thin, stubborn rhythm. Blood pressure has risen just enough to keep his organs from shutting down entirely. His skin is still pale, but no longer waxen. It is not strength returning. It is time. They reach the landing craft. 2 more stretchers are shoved beside him. The coxswain doesn't wait for balance. He guns the engine the moment the ramp lifts. Bullets skip across the water behind them. Out past the smoke, hospital ships wait like silent cities. White. Hulls marked for protection. Red crosses painted wide and visible from the air. Inside them, operating rooms hum with sterile order. Bright lights, steel instruments, surgeons who have not yet heard the shells. But even there, plasma is not the final answer. It is the bridge. In surgery, whole blood may follow. Damaged vessels will be clamped, fragments removed, organs repaired if possible. But none of that matters if the patient arrives already beyond recovery. The golden hour is not a slogan. It is a biological deadline. Without circulating volume, the body spirals. Hypothermia sets in, acidity rises, clotting fails. A cascade begins that even the best surgeon cannot reverse. Plasma interrupts that cascade. It keeps blood moving through vessels that would otherwise collapse. It keeps the brain perfused. It keeps kidneys alive long enough to function later. It keeps a heart from beating itself empty. On the rolling deck of the landing craft, a corpsman checks the wounded. Soldier again. The pulse is still there. Weak, but there. Behind them, the beach continues to burn. More men fall, more medics kneel in the sand, more glass vials are shaken in shaking hands. The war is devouring bodies by the hundreds. But for this one man, for this single fragile thread of life, a bottle of dried plasma has stretched the distance between injury and knife. And in war, sometimes survival is nothing more than reaching the next pair of hands alive. The doors to the operating ward swing shut behind the stretcher. Inside, the world changes. The roar of artillery becomes a distant vibration through steel hull. The smell of smoke gives way to antiseptic. Hands replace chaos, steady, gloved, deliberate. A surgeon leans over the wounded infantryman. His uniform has been cut away. Sand still clings to his skin, blood mats in his hair. Pressure? Low, but holding. Holding, that is the difference. Without plasma, he would have arrived silent. Pulse, gone. pupils fixed, another name for the ledger. Instead, his heart is still working, his vessels still carrying enough volume to matter. The anesthetist works quickly. The surgeon opens the abdomen and finds what the medic could not see, a torn vessel, bleeding deep and dark. Clamp, suction, suture. The room moves with quiet urgency. Minutes pass that the soldier would never have been granted on the beach. Outside, more landing craft approach. More wounded are carried in. Some will make it, some will not. But this one reaches the table alive. Hours later, wrapped in blankets below deck, he breathes steadily, pale, unconscious, alive. He does not know about centrifuges in distant laboratories. He does not know about collection drives in American cities. He does not know about dried powder packed into crates months before he ever boarded a transport ship. He only knows that he woke up. For every man saved, there were others beyond saving. Plasma was not magic. It could not reverse catastrophic loss. It could not stop every death. But it shifted the margin. It turned certain deaths into possible survivals. And on beaches where the tide carried away the fallen, possibility was everything. When the invasion ended, the beaches were cleared. Wreckage was dragged aside. The wounded were moved inland. The tide erased what it could. But something invisible remained. By the end of the war, millions of units of plasma and blood products had moved through Allied supply chains. What began as a laboratory refinement had become a standard component of modern warfare. Dried plasma kits traveled to North Africa, Italy, the Pacific Islands, and the hedgerows of France. Medics came to expect them the way they expected bandages or morphine. The system held. Men who would have died in earlier wars survived long enough to reach surgeons. Survival rates improved, not because bullets became kinder, but because medicine moved closer to the front. Plasma did not win battles. It did something quieter. It reduced the cost. After the war, the infrastructure built for combat did not disappear. Blood banks expanded. Donation systems matured. Civilian hospitals adopted methods refined under fire. The idea that life-saving transfusion products could be collected at scale, preserved, transported, and delivered rapidly became permanent. The battlefield had forced innovation, and innovation stayed. Somewhere, decades later, a veteran might pass a blood donation center without thinking about centrifuges or freeze-drying or the hands that once shook glass bottles in the sand. He might only remember waking up under white lights instead of dying under gray skies. In the worst moments of the war, survival sometimes came down to something small enough to fit in a pocket: a bottle, a line, a medic kneeling in the surf, and powder that bought just enough time to live.